90% of the 3 listeners are audio only.
Awesome.
Okay, so let's get going.
What is this? We went through the math the other day.
No, yeah, but we were going to accelerate. This is podcast.
It's
it was supposed to be
somewhere
78.
between 78 and 80.
Right, I think it's 78.
What,
But-
people listening to it?
No,
No,
my brother, but we think he stopped. So now it may be his cat.
No.
His cat.
Do we count animals in this?
Yeah, we have to. So we're on episode 78. We may accelerate it to 75 because we have a few in the can. This is a failure of the podcast, and let's go around the horn and introduce ourselves. Let's start with the man in the video, Sam.
Hey, how you doing? I'm Sam Bendett. I've known Dan for the last 22 years, so I appreciate him bringing me in. I'm currently a Russian military analyst with Center for Naval Analysis, and I look forward to the discussion. There are some caveats, obviously. There are probably some answers I won't be able to, questions I won't be able to answer, but I'll alert you to that if that happens.
Okay, and Daniel.
Yeah, so, I'm,
Who are you?
Who am I?
This is Daniel Barenboim.
This is Daniel Barenboim, that's right. Nice to meet you, Sam. I mean, for the last 22 years. So originally, I am a first-generation immigrant from the former Soviet Union. So some might look at me and say I'm Russian. I couldn't be further from being a Russian. I have no affiliation. I have no.
Yeah.
I have.
We all have Eastern European roots here.
Well, yeah. It's kind of funny how people still perceive certain things. So, I'm a techie. I'm a startup guy.
You're a former guest of this podcast.
I am a former
This
guest
is
of
what
this
your
podcast.
Your third?
My
How many times you been on?
second time.
No, it's third. You did one,
Oh,
and then
you're right.
you had a interrogation with 2 venture capitalists because
That's right.
You didn't like the elevator
And after
pitch.
that, they
No.
wou'd even talk to me.
No, we got rid of them.
Ziad wouldn't even respond to my emails.
They
anymore.
don't respond to anybody's
Oh,
email.
they don't respond.
Yeah.
Okay, and who are you? You've been on this podcast before, like 78 times.
All but one.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
That's right. No, but you didn't guest appearance.
No, that was the encyclopedia one. I was.
Oh, that's right. That was the one we failed to record, but then we recorded it
Right.
over vodka. Yes.
I'm Mark Thurman, and
You're just a podcast host.
I'm just nobody knows.
Right.
And Sam, I don't know if you had a chance, as David introduces himself, to review our body of work.
No.
Hopefully not.
I did not. No, I did not.
That's a good move.
That's a good move.
Good move.
Because if you're worried about reputational damage, this is your chance to get out now.
Yeah. So I'm Dave Pausner. I do this podcast with Mark. We've had various co-hosts who have had the good sense to leave, and we're back. So normally we attempt to be funny. We fail miserably at it, Sam. And Daniel's the unfortunate victim of a few of these. We'll keep this one as light as we can keep it, given how heavy the subject matter is. But this is very different for us.
Yes.
And I guess if it's a failure of the podcast, we could talk about the failure of Russia in Ukraine, but that's too narrow, and I'm not sure where we want to go with this. But it seemed like you two were available. We all have
it's
Eastern
more than,
yeah.
it's more than availability. And again, Sam, I did not know your background, so we won't be going into any confidential or crazy things on this. This will be our first attempt at being very serious because there's nothing to joke about here. It's in my view, and
there's nothing to joke about, but we'll do our best.
We might be a little bit lightheaded, but for people listening and the 3 people watching, in no way do I find any aspect of this situation humorous.
So let me start with this. What is it that you two? So Sam, you're a
we should have him describe what he does.
No.
I don't fully understand it.
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Sam, what angle? When you heard we were doing this podcast, what angle would interest you to talk about?
Oh, that's a good one. If anything.
Well, I think I understood this as a topic about how this conflict impacts diasporas, how this conflict impacts populations, how this impact basically creates a vast humanitarian issue, and how people across the world who are from the former Soviet Union relate or do not relate to this war.
Okay, so
that's
hold on.
No.
Dan, what do you see out of
So I see this very clearly. So Sam is very good at understanding, because it's his job, the Russian military machine, the in-depth war as it plays out. My bigger sort of look at this is from the people, the immigrants who are here, both from the former Soviet Union, who some people might consider to be Russian, who are not really truly Russian, who might be from Ukraine. What the relationship between, as you see the sort of relationship being played out between Russia and Ukraine, how people are interacting on a human level here, who have been here, who've been friends, who've been family, who've known each other for years and years. So I'm more of a personal, human aspect of it.
Oh, that's fine, okay.
So
that's the question I was going to ask.
Well, no, but
Oh, that's you have to-
I want to ask you as well. What
Well,
do
but
you
I was
think?
going to.
Just.
I was going to ask that be one of the topics.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. What do you see? What do you get out of this?
What do I get out of this?
What do you, other than the free,
Coffee and water. Water's always free. I'm getting the free electricity for my electric car.
of course. Yeah, what do you hear?
It's a serious topic, and it's like echoes from my parents' experience. So,
And my view is, I'm trying to figure out what Russia thinks they're doing. Because they must have something in mind, because it seems insane from this perspective. So,
but I was going to say, just as two dudes from the area, call it ex-Soviet Union, call it Russia, Soviet bloc. How you've got Americans out here, people here that will encounter you and say, "Hey, I noticed a slight accent. Where are you from?" A, how do you answer? And B, is the next sentence, "But I'm not for what's going on," or how do you handle that? Because most Americans, I think, are ignorant of a lot of the situation. So how does I can imagine. I know Daniel a little bit from prior podcasts and discussions and lunch and stuff. So I can imagine how he feels. But how do you handle that when someone will go, "Oh, you're from Russia, you're one of them"? Because all of a sudden, Americans are very binary.
I'm not so sure about that.
So Sam, I'll let you, since you're video bound, I'll let you kind of get into that, and then I can hop in and I can comment on my own experience.
So I think it's important to recognize that each individual is going to answer that differently. It depends on how long people have been in the United States, why they came here, what's the reason for staying or living in the United States. I think one of the major, responses that people like Dan and I can deliver is that, well, we left what was once former Soviet Union prior to all of the divisions, prior to all of the independencies, and we actually left a country that was one and whole. Obviously, it had its issues, its problems that were beginning to bubble up to the surface, but we left one country. We didn't leave one of the 15 individual states. And so we left a nation, when we left a state that had a different set of problems and different sort of ways of dealing with them. And what happened after our departure is a different history, which either does or does not have to do with us, again, depending on who you are and why you are in the United States.
Yeah. So I'll give you. So to me, it's a very loaded question, because I'll give you an anecdotal situation. So obviously everybody's on Facebook, right? There's millions of different groups that are on Facebook. I run a couple of those groups. So for example, I run a group called Russian Cape Cod. Okay, it's basically Russian people who speak Russian. Now, to me, I've been here for 32 years. In fact, just celebrated 32 years in US 2 days ago. To me, when I say Russian, to me, it's a Russian speaking, but I've seen at least 100 groups on Facebook that I'm a member of, or I see my friends are a member of, have begun to change the names from Russian something to Russian speaking something
Right.
to really sort
So
of.
you would say Cyrillic rather than Russian, just to really.
Right, so like the
obfuscate
Russian
it.
Cape Cod group became Russian-speaking Cape Cod group.
Got it.
Now, the other thing to consider is it depends on who you talk to. So me and Sam are both Jewish. So if you really sort of look at the history of our people in the former Soviet Union, it becomes a melting pot of locales. So my mother was born in Belarus. My father is from Ukraine, was born and initially raised in Ukraine. They ended up both in Moscow. So how the hell do I answer it really? I can say, you know, I don't mind saying I'm Russian. I don't, you know, I'll say I'm from Russia originally. Well, most of the time I would probably say I'm from the former Soviet Union, Sim. Would you say the same thing?
Yeah, I would. And again, it really depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to people who are knowledgeable about those issues, who have a sense of what's going on, I mean, it's one type of conversation. If it's someone off the street that asks you that, you can say former Soviet Union. Again, you have to gauge the conversation based on who you're talking to because of the very charged nature of this conflict and how some people feel about that.
Well, let me ask you, so I know that Mark and I, both our families are, you know, in my case, 4 generations back, are from Russia and Poland. And Mark's are from...
Well, my parents are ethnic Hungarians. This is how I answer it. But the town where my father was born, Ungvar, was in Hungary, then Czechoslovakia when there was such a thing, and is now Western Ukraine.
Yeah.
So this ends up working out backwards, but I keep thinking that that is we are Charlie Hebdo or whatever that was, whatever the correct.
Oh,
in
yeah.
this case, it works out completely backwards on the sort of the parallels. But the point is, I think there are a lot of folks in this country who have the same roots. There are many who don't. So I don't know what sort of prejudices you're running into. I would hope they're less, certainly here on the East Coast, but maybe they're not.
I was called the Russian prick yesterday on Facebook.
Well,
some
that's
people do that
right.
anyway.
That's right.
So I could be a prick, but don't call, you know, don't necessarily.
Yeah, your background does not inform your prickliness.
Yeah, so I mean, people see, you know, there's a lot of different things that are happening. People are refusing to speak Russian. So, for example, there is a certain subset of Ukrainians who are now refusing to speak the Russian language, which in my opinion is wrong. I'm not afraid to say that maybe we're over, how do I say that? I have people who work for me in Russia who are completely against the war, who have families, who need jobs, who need to feed their kids, who are 1000% against the war.
Yeah.
And yet they're put a lot of the times into the same category as the Russian, the Putinists, people who are for Putin, for the war, for destruction. And I don't also necessarily think that that's correct.
So I am change topics entirely. It's the topic I've been interested in. And I'm not sure either of you can answer, but what, if there's anything rational about what Putin is doing, what is it? Is it solely, is it a land grab, which I assume is what it is? Or is it the NATO issue with respect to Ukraine? Do you have any sense what, if we had somebody who was a Putineer here, what would he or she have to say about arguably rational justification for a conflict, though not to the extreme nature it's gotten?
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the open source media, if you look at the information coming out of Russia, especially recently, if you look at how Russian media describes its conflict and what kind of information is posted on Russian media, then what you're getting the sense of is that Russian military, but not just the military, it's the intelligence community, it's political elites, and others want to essentially dismantle Ukrainian state writ large so that it doesn't just present a short-term challenge to Russia with respect to NATO or basing or EU, but so that it does not present any long-term challenge to the Russian state whatsoever. There's a lot of writings by Dugin, who is one of the basically kind of whisperers behind the throne, and him and his allies put in the Russian media, in official state media, statements about denazification of Ukraine and essentially dismantling parts of it, so that there is no one single Ukraine that can either turn to the West or present a challenge to Moscow. So the rationality here, if you will, is essentially that the cost is worth it. The ends justify the means. That no matter how many losses Russian military may suffer, in the end, the result is worth it for Russia's long-term security with respect to its goals. Now, again, a lot of these decisions were made in a relative isolation from the larger discussion of these costs with the rest of the population. And it's not clear if the country is actually aware of the full scope of losses it has taken in Ukraine because of the media nature and because of the nature of this discussion inside Russia proper, because we are getting...
Can we hold you up there? Let's go back for 1 second, because you're marching forward, which is nice. But you're saying that this was essentially to create a no man's land between Russia and NATO allies, to NATO allies, at least, if you will, on that side of Russia.
The initial plan has failed. The initial military plan was this very quick blitzkrieg type into Kiev to kind of cause the shock to the Ukrainian society and the military, to change the government, depose Zelensky, and that plan has failed in the first week and a half. And then the Russian military had to change its plans and its aims. It had to pull up additional resources and launch a much larger mass-scale operation for which it probably was not very well prepared. And it is that
why was Putin not interested in actually expanding Russian territory to cover all of Ukraine? Why was it merely a question of emasculating the Ukrainian government and any notion of statehood? Because they're very different.
If Russia would be able to depose Ukrainian government quickly and efficiently, then the thinking was probably Russia and Ukraine would be able to avoid larger destruction. Because if Ukrainian industry, if Ukrainian infrastructure is destroyed and damaged in the context of a sort of a Russian invasion, the thinking was Russia would still have to invest into repairing, into sort of restructuring the country. Again, the thinking wasn't this mass-scale invasion with so much damage initially, and this analysis was rather erroneous, as we have found out, as the world has found out.
Hold on. You keep wanting to jump ahead. I know that's what you talk about most of the time, at least from what I can tell. But just so the rest of us understand, if Russia's goal was to emasculate, not to conquer the Ukraine for perhaps the reasons you just said, which is conquering Ukraine would now give it essentially an invalid, not sibling, but dependent state that it now has to rebuild. If the goal was to emasculate it, I assume the reason for that was solely NATO related. Why then would Putin not be willing to accept a statement by Zelensky and the government in Ukraine that it simply will not become part of NATO? Why is this conflict going on, notwithstanding, I think, Zelensky's agreement that he would forego the NATO membership? What am I missing?
I think these are the questions that we're going to be asking for a long time after the conflict concludes in one shape or another. A lot of this isn't really clear, and a lot of this is not easily understood, not just by the layperson, but also by experienced analysts as well. A lot of this conflict doesn't necessarily make sense from a purely military standpoint. A lot of the consequences of the last 40 days do not make sense from the political standpoint, certainly from the economic standpoint, because as we have discovered, that the world acted very swiftly targeting Russian economy with sanctions that it probably was definitely not prepared for. So again, there's too many questions and very few answers. And probably a lot of it has to do with how Putin decided and how Putin makes his decisions, and whether or not he had the full sort of aperture of options, whether he had the full information presented to him, who was actually presenting that information to him, and why, as the Western intelligence community now indicates, why didn't Putin's cabinet deliver adequate and objective information to him, why they were afraid to say what needed to be said about the Russian military itself, the quality of the invasion, and most importantly, the quality of the Ukrainian military and the quality of the Ukrainian resistance, which has proven extremely formidable.
Well, okay, so hold on. So Dan, can you give any insight on that? I know you're about must be 14,000 miles away or something.
Yeah.
But you're part of the community more than Mark and I are generations back.
I'm only first generation, so
Okay, well, I'm a few more.
You want me to comment on the reasons for Putin going?
To the extent you have any sense or even a guess as a member of the community on why this has gone sideways, because it seems insane.
Look,
What's the goal? And-
so I am far from being as knowledgeable on the issue as Sam.
However, yeah, we all can bullshit about something.
Right.
That's what this
So
podcast is all
this
about.
is a complete sort of bullshit possibility that, you know, as you're laying in bed and you're like, what the
Right.
is going on in the world and why is this happening? You have thoughts. The problem with the former Soviet bloc is that, unfortunately, no matter what country you look at there, it's full of corruption. There's backhanded deals everywhere. And so in reality, one of the reasons that I also think Sam could be right, that we might never know and we might be wondering for years to come. I don't know. I mean, just throwing things out there, who knows? Maybe there was some kind of an agreement between Putin and Ukraine before, and Putin felt betrayed, and some parts of that agreement weren't done by Zelensky. I don't know, and he decided to show his strength, and he went mad in a sense, and he just went after that.
well, here's my question, because obviously Ukraine was involved in an American scandal with the last president here. What is it about Ukraine that makes it sort of the punching bag for everybody? It was the punching bag for Trump. It's clearly the punching bag for Putin. What is it? What are the attributes?
Let me comment on that. And we have to be careful about what we say and what kind of words we use. So I would not use these terms. Look, Ukraine is a very personal issue for Putin, because if you go back to the end of the former Soviet Union and the emergence of independent states, Russia has emerged as the key and the central nation for practically all of the former Soviet states, save the Baltics, which became part of European Union and part of NATO very quickly. Almost every other former Soviet state retains economic, social, cultural, military-industrial relationships with Russia, and Russia is the predominant state in those, in that network, in those relationships. And so when Russia started to recreate a set of systems and interdependencies with itself in the center, like the Eurasian Economic Union, which it envisioned to be the the competitor to the European Union or the competitor to the Chinese sphere of influence. The Eurasian Economic Union is made up of the bulk of the former Soviet population and industrial strength, encompassing Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus. Ukraine was supposed to be a very significant part of that network. And Ukraine has the second largest population after Russia. It has the second largest economy, had second largest economy after Russia. Ukraine and Russia probably have as close as a relationship as, for example, or had prior to 2014 as, for example, United States and Canada, when it comes to cultural, historical issues. But most importantly, these sort of socioeconomic and cultural interdependencies that were built into the relationship between these states after 1992. And so not having Ukraine as part of that network was a tremendous loss for Russia going forward, that it could not really emerge as this central state that could compete as an equal with the United States or European Union or China without Ukraine. And so tracing that back to 1992, with the arrival of Putin, we're starting to get the sense of sort of his thinking, his rationale on the Russian-Ukrainian relationships. And so several years ago, he was making statements about that. Recently, he kind of he penned this article about Ukrainian history and how it relates to Russia. So this almost became a personal issue for Putin, that Ukraine could not be independent and anti-Russian in the sense that it could be independent and pro-European Union and possibly even pro-NATO. And finally,
okay, so there was an article in the either New York or Atlantic this weekend, and I forgot who they quoted, but it was somebody early on who said that consistent with what you said, that Russia plus Ukraine, that combination will, and I don't think it was Churchill, but maybe that era, the combination of Russia and Ukraine can dominate the world, can be a central figurehead as a world power. I guess sufficiently active to battle back China and the like, and Europe. So that seems consistent. That comment from way back goes along with what you said. That would also go along with not destroying Ukraine in the course of this conflict, which now seems to be happening. Or is that not really the case? There's a lot of destruction in Ukraine, but does it turn out that a lot of the value of Ukraine is still in the wheat fields? And so from Putin's perspective, if he's rational at all, he's knocking out some of the major cities, but he still gets the bulk or enough of Ukraine that they can be a power if they move forward together, which would never happen.
well, on the one hand, obviously.
Hang on a second, Sam. Let me comment on something.
Perfect.
I don't know. I don't necessarily know if I agree with everything that you're saying. I understand that this might be a position, but it seems that
Me or Sam?
Sam.
Yeah.
It seems that this is a lot more personal and a lot more visceral than any kind of a political ambition that he has. Because if he had a political ambition, cooler heads would have prevailed weeks ago, and steps would have been taken in order to stop the war, keep what's been sort of the advances that have been made, and even possibly stretch out the strategy over a longer period of time, do a combination of political and a war combination. Putin is not an idiot in the sense that he completely realizes that Ukraine will never really submit at this point, and he's never going to get an ally in the face of Ukrainian people. So I don't know if there is a bigger sort of strategy here at play, that he's looking to bring the two countries together and make a bigger bloc.
Does he have any evidence of? Is there a history of his being sort of there was a quote, again, I'll say the New Yorker last night. A quote from a biographer. He apparently said, when I was in a playground, wherever he grew up as a poor boy in the playground, somebody attacked him and he learned to be a bully. Is that what this is? Is there any evidence of your rationality other than that story?
Well,
Look, again, going back, kind of zooming out here, right? If a different military strategy would have prevailed early on in the war, if Russia were to launch the campaign that it was technically prepared for, and if it would have been very quick, if it could have overwhelmed Ukrainian military and captured Kiev as they intended, not with the force that was launched, but with a different force, then there would have been pressure to sort of recognize the fait accompli, stop the fighting, and negotiate some kind of outcome out of this. Again, if this was a different type of an invasion, but Putin may have underestimated the Ukrainian resolve, certainly underestimated the quality of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian desire to remain independent of any significant relationships with Russia, save economic ones. And so this is important to note. Even after the Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass in 2014 and 2015, for several years after a fully belligerent relationship was on full display, Ukraine continued to trade with Russia because there were economic relationships that could not be broken. And so Russia was able to sort of sever those relationships only around 2018, early 2019, when it claimed that it was able to import, substitute a lot of military tech that was coming from Ukraine. Nonetheless, Russia's gas pipelines were still running through Ukraine. And so fully severing a relationship between Ukraine and Russia was not possible because of these economic interrelationships. And obviously the historical context, the cultural context was also there. And so Russia began to craft its own narrative that Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian history isn't necessarily that of an independent state, but rather something that Russian state has created. And in the meantime, Ukraine was actually going back to history, calling to attention the fact that a modern Russia or historical Russia emanates out of Ukraine proper.
Okay, hold on.
So
Hold on, Sam.
let me go back to what you were saying before, because I'm just trying to remember my comment. Two comments. Number one, you were talking about sort of, what appears to be the strategy. And as you were saying that, I was thinking it's almost like a spurned lover. Well, if I can't have you, I'm going to destroy you. That's one thought, which is the way again, I'm reacting to what you said and what I'm seeing on TV, which I can barely watch. And the second thing is, I look at Hungary, where my parents were from. It is aligned with NATO, but they're also aligned with Orban is an ally also of Putin. So in a sense, you have the case of a state that actually has it both ways, has one foot in both worlds.
Well, actually, I think Hungary is under enormous pressure right now from the European Union, precisely because of what you just said. And so there's a lot of discussions about Hungarian responsibility as a member of the European Union, with essentially adopting a set of policies and politics, right? Hungary and Russia, meaning Orban and Putin, were able to find common language because Hungary, like Russia, lost a lot of its territories and its fellow countrymen after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when parts of historical Hungary ended up in present-day Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, etc. And for Putin, when he talked about the tragedy of the fall of the Soviet Union, he was referring to, as we found out later on, to the fact that many of the Russian compatriots ended up in other states. Some ended up without proper rights and proper recognition by their newly established home countries. And so that to him was an enormous tragedy. But again, Ukraine remained a rather personal issue for him in the context of what Ukraine means to the larger Russian sphere of influence and the relationships established between former Soviet states and Russia. I think it's important to recognize another fact, that unlike European states or unlike United States or maybe other countries around the world, Russia doesn't really recognize the concept of a neutral state. That a state on its border must either be pro-Russian and therefore does not present a danger, or it is already in the adversarial camp and presents a certain set of problems, the way, for example, Russia sees the Baltics. And so,
how does Russia view Switzerland then? I know it's not on its border, but that's an example of a so-called neutral state.
Well, I mean, it recognizes the existence of neutralities, but when it comes to its own safety and security, right? If you look at the states aligned at the Russian border, until recently, they all were very much essentially, if not openly pro-Russian, then at least adopting a set of policies that didn't, from Moscow's standpoint, threaten or challenge them. If you look at Central Asia, if you look at Belarus, Georgia wanted to join the European Community and NATO, and Moscow executed a campaign that crippled Georgian future in the European Union, because there are two frozen conflicts inside Georgia now. And so again, Ukraine could not be an independent state and not be openly pro-Russian from the standpoint of Kremlin security. And I think it is that type of thinking that fed a reasoning sort of, or influenced reasoning in the Kremlin, whether or not it was based on actual facts, and whether or not the Russian president actually got a full set of figures to work with, right?
Okay, hold on.
This conflict.
Hold on.
All right. So, okay. So my thing is, okay, all those predictions, all those assumptions, all those desires are out of the window. I mean, whatever he thought he was going to do, it's gone and done. I mean, that's it. So where the hell does this go? How,
Yeah, what now?
what the hell is the future? I mean, what now? Do we,
Great question.
how do you see it now? I mean, and he must realize that it's done and gone, all of those ambitions, if he truly had them.
No, why would
he
you
does.
realize that?
Well, because he understands that even if he takes over the entire Ukraine, he's going to have a partisan war on the ground for years and years and years.
Yeah, so, but that went on.
Think Germany.
I mean, maybe this is a culture where you can live with ongoing wars.
And
Maybe
you also
you're-
have to
No,
you
it's
have to
support.
recognize that, and this is not something that was covered in the Western media a lot, is that there was actually low-level insurgency taking place in the Russian portion of the Caucasus for years after the conclusion of the first Chechen War. And there were terrorist acts, explosions, there were kidnappings. There was this kind of low simmering conflict that Russia was able to contain and control within its own borders. So it's not about living with that. It's about what's the level of tolerance to that type of conflict. Of course, Ukraine is many magnitudes greater than Chechnya ever was. And again, it's not clear if this is fully understood in the Kremlin, at least from our standpoint. Here's the important issue to recognize, that Russian media now, or the Russian government, is controlling the media, that it has attempted to stamp out any independent media outlet to craft its own narrative. And that enabled Russian government to craft a narrative that would allow people to sort of rally around the flag, whether or not they agree with the war or not, right? There are official polls that talk about like 3/4 of the population in Russia supporting this campaign. It's not clear if these polls are objective. But again, in the absence of media competition, it is possible to craft a narrative that would enable the government to sort of tell the population that this is a long-term fight and struggle, and that the country would be able to survive it.
Sam, there was a article in today's Times, I guess, that the point, or maybe an opinion piece, and the point of it was that the only way to battle back Putin at this point is to turn his own people against him. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with your comment about the media.
Not just his own people. I don't think you can turn the people are completely brainwashed. If you're talking about his own people in the government,
no, it's they clearly have the population. And the question is, as an observer for the last 61 years, it strikes me that he's able to stamp on the people routinely, and then none of this should be bothering him. The news media to me seems like a small annoyance, and it does seem to get the people rallied up. But he's always been able to crush his own people. Why would that statement in the Times, I think it was the Times, carry any ring of truth at all? Why do the people really mad at him?
Because prior to 2018, there existed a social contract between Putin and his people, that as long as the Russian economy was more or less stable, and as long as the people's livelihood wasn't threatened, and as long as people lived better than in the 1990s, had opportunities, could look towards the future, the people would not necessarily complain or counter or try to sort of disagree with what the Russian government and Putin himself was doing, right?
Why does it matter? When has that government turned over because of the people since what, 1917?
No, but I think he made this is like a very big point.
So let me
So-
finish. Let me finish the point. And so this contract existed again prior to 2018, even a few short years after the Russian seizure of Crimea and its involvement in eastern Ukraine, because the Russian economy was able to handle the pressure from sort of the international competition. The industries were growing, incomes were more or less stable, people had opportunities to travel. Russia was a better place, objectively speaking, than it was in the 1990s. And as long as that contract was in place, people weren't necessarily rebelling against the government. And they were occasional, but they were occasional.
I can answer your question.
Wait. What evidence is there that the people in that government, in that country, can do anything?
Because
wasn't it 1917 the last time that happened?
Well, no, but throughout, post World War II, they were rebuilding. They lived.
Rebuilding. When
Let
have
me
the people in
finish.
that
Let
country
me
ever
finish.
done anything?
That's not the point. The point is that their life was better. I think Sam said it. That their life was better than their parents' lives. And the contract, which I think
Who
is a very.
cares about the contract?
If you let me
Well,
talk,
it's important.
I'll
It's actually very important because even when there were certain low-level protests against pension reforms in Russian states, which I think took place around like 2017, 2018, and mass-scale protests against the government in Moscow in 2012, this didn't catch on with the rest of the population because the rest of the population wanted to see themselves doing better with respect to the 1990s, whether or not that was true. Of course, if we look at Russia as a country, right, there are several regions which may have very high standards of living, certainly Moscow at the top of that list with nearly European standards of living, while the rest of the country was struggling. But the government was able to craft a narrative that even in those struggles, even when things weren't necessarily going well for those people, they were still doing better than the 1990s, and this was because of President Putin.
I still don't feel like I can answer this question. Can you answer the question?
What?
From my perspective, the people in that country have almost no ability to overturn a reasonably strong government, period. So that the social contract is just an easy narrative for us all to pretend it matters. What really matters? What really scares
They
people?
have the ability, they don't have the desire to turn it over.
When is there any proof they've had the ability? Do they really have the ability?
There's more of them.
ability, the proof in the ability is, in my opinion, which is a little different than what you're asking, but World War II.
Yes.
Okay, that's the proof of the ability of the Russian people. Okay, it's also proof of the ability of the Russian government not to give a shit about their people.
Am I correct? 1917 was the people, or was that actually just a political party?
Yeah, there have been many revolutions. So at the point, let Daniel finish his point, and I'll try and get my point out.
So Russian. When you think of Russia is huge, huge. Now, when you think here about Framingham, which is not Boston,
Our fair city.
you are still in our fair city. You're still thinking malls. You're thinking restaurants. You're thinking all that stuff. When you're thinking about Russia, you think Moscow and the greater sort of area around Moscow, but everything outside of that is basically you're knee deep in shit.
Yeah.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but majority of the people. So the well-off people who are in Moscow, a lot of them have left as a result of this because they don't want to lose the money. Okay. They don't want to lose their abilities. They already have contracts outside.
Some of them have left.
Some of them have left. The ones who have stayed, a lot of them are still making money because of whatever arrangements they have. Majority of the Russian population are not that well off. All of their lives, they've drank, they've lived a life barely over the limit of.
They've struggled.
Yeah, that, to say the least. So when somebody, there's a reverse fear here. There is. I don't think there is a wonder of how great it's going to be in the future. I think it's more about how to prevent getting totally screwed tomorrow. And so anybody who is able to keep any kind of stability, any kind of level, they are absolutely for that person. And so Putin has become the
I'm questioning whether.
am I wrong, Sam?
I'm just
I'm
questioning
sorry.
whether this really matters.
Well,
My
okay.
question is, the whole point of, as I understand, the whole point of the sanctions is to, A, put pressure on the oligarchs, which we hoped would get us somewhere, it may or may not. And number two, to put pressure on the people so they will revolt. And the question is that really something that could
I don't
ever
think the
happen?
sanctions
So,
matter
so this takes us now to the present, right? And I mentioned the social
Yes.
contract as sort of this larger framework that allowed Russian president to rule since 2000 without any significant challenges, no matter how we look at that here in the United States or the West. The sanctions, as imposed today, have a very significant crippling effect. And if the Russian economy isn't able to bear the weight of the sanctions, and if the regular people are starting to feel that, that is when we're going to sort of see that unraveling of that social contract between the Russian president and his people. And it's not even clear if everybody's going to go into the streets. What's important is to recognize that, for example, in 1991, right, December of 91, I mean, the protests were mostly in Moscow, right? They weren't necessarily widespread across the rest of the former Soviet Union because the rest of the country, the rest of Russia and the rest of the former Soviet Union really weren't understanding what was happening. And so if people go to the streets en masse, for example, in the capital city, because things have gotten so bad that the normal livelihood is threatened, that's when we can potentially see a change. It isn't clear if Putin was able to calculate the weight of the sanctions. It's not clear if he understood how powerful those sanctions are going to be against his economy.
Do you believe that it's possible? So it sounds like the West is not going to easily fight Putin back without risk of nuclear war. At least that's what he's telling us. And so we can't throw missiles at them. We can't put troops in Russia. We probably can't even put troops in Ukraine, number one. Number two, it sounds like we're trying to put pressure on his people to put pressure on him. Number one, that's going to take at least years, at least a few years. Number one. Number two, is it not the case that he can still battle them back, notwithstanding social contracts? The country's largely not that populated. Do these riots go anywhere? Tiananmen Square didn't really get the Chinese people that far. What's going to happen? There's going to be Moscow Square, whatever it's called.
Well, I don't think they had the same social contract in China.
Bullshit, but the social contract is bullshit.
No,
the social contract is
No,
bullshit.
it's not actually. It's not.
Let me get it out.
It's a very important framework. It's a very important framework to view the stability and the survivability of the Putin regime. I mean, that's how he was able to govern relatively peacefully from his standpoint between 2000 and February 2022. If things get so bad that the economy begins to crumble, and if this begins to affect regular people, we may see some kind of change within the government, right? Some kind of changeover. Look, Khrushchev was removed by the Politburo in 1964 because the Politburo did not see him as capable of handling a range of problems encountered by Soviet Union vis-a-vis United States. And again, whether this palace coup is possible or not, a significant change must come from the government because the people in Russia today cannot fully mobilize themselves for a wide-scale set of protests to launch the cascading effects.
The people can't mobilize themselves. So why would the Politburo, or whatever it's called now, what's going to make them make a change?
All right, I'm going to say a completely exaggerated example, but you know, in my non-professional way, this is the way I think about it. Sorry, Sam. Last days, May of 1945. Russians and Americans are in Berlin fighting. There's still German troops that are fighting, that are dying for Germany. The only people who are looking to make the change are the people who are right-hand people of Hitler.
Right.
The only way that I see that Putin is ever removed is when the people that are closest to him realize that they're losing more than they're gaining, and that there is no more ability, and there is never going to be the ability for Putin to make them more money. This is when they are going to.
This seems like we are negotiating an entire country now based on a hope that either the people will rise up or that somebody in whether the oligarchs or otherwise are going to see a potential.
That's the premise. That's the premise that Sam keeps raising that I keep trying to echo in on. I won't use social contract. Here's the deal. It's a mafia regime.
Yes.
And as long as you let me do whatever the hell I want, I'll make sure that incrementally your life is better than your parents and your kids' lives will be better than yours. You let me do whatever the hell I want, and you guys can live stably in a stable way. You can educate your kids. You'll have food on the table. You can go to the store and buy stuff. You can go and leave the country and go on vacation. It's a deal.
My point is that the people cannot.
Sam, am I wrong?
Hold on. My point is
that's a good point, right? So the incremental improvements that took place every year after 2000 created the impression that life indeed was better and safer and more stable than in the 1990s. Whether or not that was true for the larger population, because those changes were actually true in the capital, right? In Moscow and St. Petersburg and a handful of other states, there were very visible improvements made to the livelihood of the people, and so that enabled the government to craft a narrative that with Putin in government, things could get better. The other narrative was, who else is there if Putin isn't there to keep Russia stable, to keep it secure, to ensure that things keep improving? Again, it isn't clear right now whether that reasoning is still applied. And certainly the government is crafting the narrative that it is able to survive these sanctions and this pressure. But if the pressure is felt by the regular people, not just by the richest and the most powerful, then this becomes a very different type of conversation between the Kremlin and the population.
What is the timetable? We are talking years now. Ukraine will be crushed or under a long-term war. Why is the only solution not a military solution? I'm sorry.
Military solution, are you referring to the Russian military solution against Ukraine, or
a NATO military solution that at least protects the Ukraine?
No, because that at least initially, and this is how the United States president views it, getting NATO involved pushes, it creates a situation of a direct confrontation between nuclear powers over Ukraine and can raise the specter of a actual nuclear exchange.
So what is the likelihood that Ukraine will survive long enough for these sanctions to take effect on the people, for the people to figure out how to rise up so that they can actually remove Putin? How long Ukraine is going to be smoldering by then?
It is smoldering.
Okay. Well, I don't think this goes further than 2 more months.
Why not?
Militarily, a lot would be decided in Ukraine in the next couple of weeks. As the Russian military got exhausted in the first 40 days, it has to take some kind of a breather, it has to take a pause, but there's evidence that it is beginning to sort of rearm, reposition itself for a limited set of gains, meaning if the Russian gains now include all of Donbass region, the Donetsk and Lugansk, plus the southern region, the Crimea, and then area north of Crimea, then that could be presented as a significant sort of achievement, because the rest of Ukraine, as we just mentioned, is no longer a challenge because of so much damage that has been inflicted on their industry, the military, and the civilian population.
How do we know that wasn't the plan to begin with? Soften up the main body, then go for the edges.
I don't think you would go intentionally lose 12,000 soldiers.
Maybe they don't give a shit.
Oh, they don't give a shit about soldiers.
Yeah.
Soldiers are irrelevant.
So the initial plan, the initial plan was this regime change via a fast attack into Kiev, right, without necessarily launching this wide-scale destruction, which is just absolutely horrific. That was the initial plan, but the plan was poorly executed because Ukrainian resistance was apparently poorly understood in the Russian military, or at least the true facts about the quality of Ukrainian resistance wasn't delivered up to the highest to the top decision makers. And so the question is, why wasn't that information communicated, and why did the Russian military have to change the tactics to then launch this wide-scale invasion that it was poorly prepared for?
How do we know that the goal wasn't simply to take the Donbass and other regions? How do we know?
They could have done that quickly and
Well,
easily.
it was probably one of the goals, but it probably wasn't the primary goal. The primary goal, as I mentioned, was a kind of a quick attack, decapitate Ukrainian government, and take over the country without a lot of destruction. Once that no longer became possible, once Ukrainian military started offering very significant resistance, then the larger invasion was launched. But again, even that effort was poorly coordinated, as became clear very quickly.
Okay, so now there's going to be a long simmering battle over this region, and Zelensky and Ukraine is never going to give up its territorial claim. So is it going to be just a continuation of what's been going on for the last, since 2008?
That's
Or
one
14?
option. That's one option, yes.
So, Sam, if propaganda is the game in Russia, okay, I was thinking yesterday, this might sound stupid, but, there's all these opportunities that are now being created in order to save and help the millions of Ukrainian refugees. Why not announce on the border with Poland, on all of the other borders along the sort of Ukrainian theater, that if any Russian military personnel who truly believes, because these are kids, these are 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old kids that are going into battle, and we already know they're showing up there under sometimes false pretenses to where they're actually going. At least in the beginning, they were thrown that way. Why not say, look, if you're a military person and you want to defect, we're guaranteeing you some kind of a citizenship or a path or an amnesty.
Families.
Okay, families, and we'll help the families or whatever. But wouldn't that be a huge propaganda vehicle in order to be able to sort of get it through to the Russian people that even the soldiers are not willing to fight on behalf of the.
If I were Putin, I would then kill a few of the families.
Which I'm sure he's already done.
He's done it. He does it anyway.
Well, my point is, you can quickly stamp that out.
Dan, what you said is obviously is a very logical solution. It's difficult to execute logistically because those soldiers would have to cross the entirety of Ukraine to go west towards Poland or Slovakia. So, as far as the quality of the Russian soldiers, yes, it has been surprisingly poor. Russia does have well-trained forces. Russia does have well-trained and well-prepared battalion tactical groups, but as this severity of the conflict became clear, the entirety of the Russian force had to be involved. And again, Russian military was training for all these years against a defensive, or actually it was training for a defensive operation. Even as recently as late 2021, in an joint exercise with Belarus, they were training for a defensive operation when they were attacked by a much superior, technologically advanced force, such as NATO and the United States. This offensive combat isn't something that Russia trained for. And again, this is one of the questions we can't answer 100%. We don't know for sure why these decisions were made and what they're thinking in their headquarters as they're losing soldiers, losing equipment, and obviously as evidence mounts that a lot of these efforts may not be as successful as originally envisioned.
Okay, hold on.
So here's how this ends, both the podcast and the
I
conflict.
had one last question.
But no, I want to ask my question now.
Yeah.
If you buy my premise that this is a mafia state and the continuation of these sanctions puts enough pressure on the oligarchs and all the people, again, like you're impacting all the Don and the whatever the rank and file of these the oligarch state. That's the Politburo now, is all of the oligarchs. Well, we've now screwed with them. At a certain point, they're all going to go to him, I think. And you know, Vlad, you got to go, or they'll take him out one way or another. Because I think it's like a mafia state.
They'll have
That's
to.
not that's not entirely. I mean, it's not entirely applicable because
That's right, though.
look, during the Soviet times, a lot of people in Stalin's closest retinue knew the extent and the scale of the damage that his policies were doing to the Soviet Union and to the people. But they didn't take him out. They were all afraid. They were afraid of him. They were afraid for their own position. There were maybe other factors, even as they saw that the purges and other policies were undercutting the very strength of the Soviet Union that was announced in public statements, right? And so there are people who are around Putin that view their position as key to his, or rather their position as tied to his own survival, right? If Putin goes, they may go as well. And this may be preventing them from making the moves that you were discussing.
But the minute that calculus changes is when Putin loses support, is my point of view. So this is beyond an oligarch going on the news saying, I was crying, I couldn't get a private plane today. And this is, you know, you've got a lot of people who made money because of Putin, and Putin makes money because of them. There's a certain point where, again, the calculus changes, and, you know, the guy that brought us here isn't going to be the guy that gets us to this next level.
But also,
so they'll change them out.
But also, Sam, I want to say there's a huge difference between those times and nowadays. Back then, the value was your riches were inside the Soviet Union.
Now they're not.
Now they're not. Now it's the international money, it's the dollars, it's your children who are in London, who are in US, it's the money that you have in US dollars spread across the world. So before they were afraid to take out the leader because they could manipulate their existence inside the borders of the country. It's very different now. So I think money is going to play a huge role. I think he's either going to be removed by the people, or better yet, I think he's going to be served on the platter and not killed, but served on the platter to the international community to stand the trial.
Yeah, that may be. Yeah, that may be.
In order to facilitate some kind of a cease and better agreement.
His head will roll.
That's right. His head will roll, but that will serve as a.
So let me change topics as we get to the end of this, which is quickly. How safe a game is it for Putin to be playing with China, which seems like it could overrun Putin and his army readily, easily, and Putin must know that. So he's got to be very uncomfortable with China backing him, and China must love this opportunity. How does that one play out in a paragraph or so?
It does look like China loved this opportunity. There is no specter of a military confrontation between China and Russia. That has been settled a long time ago. That's no longer the argument. It is now the economic relationship. And of course, China sees itself as one of the key nations that is capable of solving a lot of Russian economic issues. And even Russians themselves, especially in the IT sector, which has been disproportionately affected by the sanctions, also see China as a way to counter a lot of these sanctions. Again, the full extent of that isn't necessarily known. For example, China did say that they're willing to maintain their information communication technologies relationship with Russia, continue to invest, continue to sort of gobble up the Russian market. And if the sanctions exert so much pressure on Russia that it doesn't have a choice, it will accept a much larger Chinese role in the Russian economic affairs. But there's also a limit to how much China can do that, because China is also plugged into the global supply chains. It is very much part of the global economic network. China is one of the most important countries in the world when it comes to a lot of economic factors, right? And so it doesn't necessarily go all in defending Russia, because China can also end up under pressure from United States or other countries because of the support of Beijing for Moscow. So this is sort of an evolving relationship right now, and the news can almost change on a daily basis. China certainly sees its role as very important. It's a mediator, it's an investor, it's an economic supporter, but we don't necessarily see a lot of sort of Chinese rushing into the Russian market and saying, okay, sell everything to us so we can save you. That's not the case also.
Okay, so we've come to the end of our hour. This was, you got a thought?
He should introduce himself again because you
Yeah.
didn't have it recorded.
Oh, yeah, well, we haven't, it's been recorded on this, but one last time. So Sam, we'll have program notes with your name and everything. Mark's pointing out that the Microsoft recording wasn't on, but the others were.